Hi folks, welcome back. Our first lecture, official lecture, will be over Chapter 1, and it's called A First Look at Communication. So again, this is the book Communication Mosaics, An Introduction to the Field of Communication by Julia Wood, and I'm working off of the 7th edition. You're welcome to use an earlier edition, but the page numbers that I reference are from the 7th, which is 2014. So, Chapter 1, we'll be working through defining communication, talking about the communication models, which are foundations for a lot of the rest of the pieces we talk about, and talking about the benefits of communication. Why study it? Why know it? Why be good at it? So, I would like you to remember that these lectures are reviewing a few crucial parts of the chapter. They're meant to supplement your notes. They do not replace them. I do not try to tackle everything in the book, and if you have questions, please email me or ask a classmate, but I'm trying to supplement and reiterate some of the more complex pieces, but not cover everything. So, as you go through, write down lingering questions. It's difficult to remember all of them in the moment, and I suggest kind of adding to the notes you've already taken as you write, as you watch these. So before we dig in, and this is going to be applicable to all of the lectures, is I want to review some language distinctions for you. You'll see communication written several ways. When we talk about communication with a capital C, we're talking about the discipline of communication, the major, similar to sociology, psychology, anthropology, right? Anytime it's a capital C, we're talking about the discipline. When we see a lowercase c, we're referring to the act of communicating between people. One of the biggest things I see is people writing communications with an S. And I just want to let you know that that is a completely different thing than what we'll be talking about here. Communications with an S is concerned with things like fiber optic cables and how we physically convey a message from one point to another. So communications, telecommunications, is concerned with radio, television, internet, all of those pieces. Instead, we're focusing on the human study of communication. Right? So we do not put an S at the end. That's one of the distinctions. We focus on how messages affect and influence people, relationships, and society. And yes, getting the message to the audience does come into play here, but we're not looking at telecommunications. So in other words, you're not taking a communications class, so don't write it on your assignments, on your notes, or in your resume that you are. You are a communication class member. All right, so Chapter 1. Every chapter has a few focus questions, and these are put together by the author. They show up at the beginning of the chapter, and looking over the focus questions gives you a sense of where she's focused, how she's written the book, and kind of what her priorities are for you to get out of it. So at the beginning of each chapter's lecture, I'll review what those focus questions are. Sometimes we won't go over all of them, especially if they are very clearly stated. I will leave them to you. But there are quite a few that often end up being more complex and important to review. So in this case, we'll definitely be talking about how is communication defined and how the different models represent the process of human communication. And we'll briefly cover the benefits and how communication process and skills are relevant. And then the careers piece I will totally leave to your reading, but please do ask if you have questions about it. There's also some more information about careers and communication when you hit Chapter 2, both in the book itself and in the supplemental materials that I've given you. So let's talk about how is communication defined. It is, after all, the class that you're taking. So what is it? Wood is defining communication as a systemic process in which people interact with and through symbols to create and interpret meanings. So there's some important parts of this definition that we want to break down, because when we look at a definition, what it's doing is it's laying out the framework for how we're supposed to understand this really big idea. How do we understand the framework for this entire book that she's written, for this entire class that we talk about? Because different definitions give us different information and send us to focus in different places. So, communication is a systemic process in which people interact with and through symbols to create and interpret meanings. So that it's systemic means that it's part of a system, right? we have multiple parts that interact, and a system is always trying to maintain homeostasis, which means it's trying to stay the same and stay balanced, and that it's systemic also means that it's holistic. Holistic meaning it applies to everything. Communication is a process. It is always ongoing. It's always dynamic. So your relationship with someone as it develops over time reflects that your communication is going to change over time. How we interact. These are based on human interaction. So how you interact in that first meeting, going back to process, to how you interact a year later, or how we interact on the first day versus 4 weeks from now. Those are all different, right? And so that's going to affect how we communicate. It's going to affect our interaction. We communicate through symbols, and the 3 key terms here about symbols is that they are ambiguous, they are abstract, and they are arbitrary. Ambiguous, they're vague, right? It can have multiple meanings, which is why it's so important that you're clear. Abstract means we can talk about these big ideas that aren't physical objects. We can talk about things like religion and love and belief and God and war and learning and communication and all of these things. So abstract concepts are those really kind of high in the clouds ideas, and not, for instance, the physical table in front of you. Arbitrary means that symbols are not naturally occurring. The words that we use, the gestures that we use, the flags that we use, the assigning of meaning to that, someone just picked it, right? So someone just decided this thing will be called a table, this thing is a book, right? Here's what love means, right? So arbitrary means that someone picked a definition, which is one of the reasons why we might have different meanings and different definitions across culture, across families, and one of the reasons why symbols can be so ambiguous. So a really big piece that comes out of all of this is that communication is meaning making. We interact through this process of symbols with people in our systems in order to create meaning. And it's important to know that there are 2 levels of meaning going on. One is the content level of meaning. Content are the words themselves. The relational level of meaning is how do these words connect us or not, right? So, for instance, we talk about the content level and the relational level. My favorite example is 3 words, the phrase, I love you. Content, I love you. 3 words, 8 letters, right? But when you hit the relational level of meaning, it can mean so many different things depending who you're talking to, right? So when you talk to your grandmother and you love her and it's respectful, family-based love, you talk to your romantic partner and there's usually a very different kind of intimacy than you would have with your grandmother. Or 2 a.m. on a Friday, best friend, there might have been drinks involved, right? That version of, oh, I love you, man, is very different, I hope, than the other 2 versions, right? So we see the same content across all 3 of those, but a very different relational meaning, relationship meaning. So some key terms that are coming in relation to the relational level of meaning is that it's related to we express liking, we express responsiveness, and we can even express power. Right? So content level, relational level, and every message has both of these levels. It's 2 sides of the same coin. So there is no message that does not in some way have both of these. Right? And that's what we're going to argue as we move through the quarter. So do remember that. So communication, systemic process in which people interact with and through symbols to create and interpret meanings. All right, so something that does not show up in your book, but is one of kind of the foundational pieces of our class, is this term of competent communication. Right? So what does it mean to be a competent communicator? So it means that you need to communicate effectively and appropriately. And when I say this, I mean that other people also have to perceive that your communication is effective and appropriate. This can't just be a, well, I think it is, so it's very important that it's a relational piece. So what is effectiveness and what is appropriateness? Effectiveness is this idea of progressing towards achieving your goals. Is your goal to get a date? Is your goal to get an A? Is your goal to work well with your group members? Right, whatever it might be. So effectiveness means, are you progressing towards achieving your goals? And a competent communicator is going to take into account what are the goals of the other people involved here also, right? How can we take all of them into account and to have a supportive communication climate, not just I'll step on anyone to get where I need. It's also important to note that effectiveness means that we have context-specific goals. Most goals will not apply across all contexts, right? So you really need to be aware of, in this situation, here's the goal, here's how it would be achieved. Right? So we use the term context a lot, and I just want to take a moment and remind folks that that means situation. It can be time, place, people. It's a very big picture term for situation. As we go through and you aren't sure of what words mean, and if I don't end up defining it, please make a note of it, look it up, let me know, whatever it is, just so I can make sure that we're all clear. So effectiveness, progressing towards achieving goals, and appropriateness means that you are communicating in a way that fits the context, fits the situation, that you're following the rules for the context. We'll talk in a moment about what rules are and what some of these might look like. But it's important to know that there are social rules, social expectations for almost any context that we're a part of. And there's two different levels of these rules. There are explicit rules and implicit rules. Explicit, stated, right? Very clearly put out there, right? So for instance, no late work in class is an explicit rule in our context of class. Implicit rules are the ones that are implied. They're the ones that maybe you heard them a long time growing up, but you don't hear them in every situation, even though you know they still apply. Right? So for instance, not swearing at the teacher. That's one that maybe you had to be told when you were little and you were learning new fun words. But in general, it's not something that you have to think that hard about as you then move through school later. So it's important aspect of appropriateness is that you also know when the rules can be bent, right? So there's that old adage that you need to know the rules before you can break them, right? That's the case here too. And it's also important to note that what it means to be inappropriate is that you're violating a rule for no good reason. There are times when violating a rule can be very effective, right? If you're a public speaker and you surprise your audience because you do this thing that they were not expecting and is different, that may be a really appropriate way to break a rule in order to keep your audience engaged, right? But it's really going to depend on the level to which you break that rule. So, for instance, I had a student one semester who was giving a speech and started off their speech using the word bitch multiple times. Yes, he caught the audience's attention and managed to offend half the class in the process. So be really aware of where those rules lie. And honestly, if you take a step back and you think about basic social expectations, you can start to articulate those rules. And it gets pretty interesting to think about why we have the social rules that we do. So knowing and adapting to the explicit and implicit rules of a situation, of the context, is a key piece of being a competent communicator. So let's talk more about those rules. So we have implicit and explicit dimensions of communication. Explicit, as I mentioned, are these stated rules, expectations of a situation. Implicit are the implied rules. It's what's expected of you because of social norms, even if no one mentions it every time. So for example, explicit, a lot of classes, attendance policies. Implicit, when someone greets you, you reply. Right? It's a basic social rule. So I want you to take a moment and pause the lecture and write in your notes examples of both explicit and implicit rules and expectations, either in your workplace or in classes. Right? If you do have a job, then it's fascinating to look at what you've discovered of the rules within your work. Right? So write down some examples. I'd love to hear them if we chat. And it's really an effective way to study. right? And to help remember the concepts is to have these examples in your notes. And it's also worth noting that a lot of questions I ask on those quizzes are asking you to think about the concepts as they relate to life. And so to actually apply concepts to examples. So take a moment, pause the lecture, and write down some examples. Hopefully you came up with some good examples for your implicit and explicit rules within different contexts. Let's shift gears and talk about the communication models. So when we talk about theories and definitions of what is human communication, those theories have changed pretty significantly over time. And an important way we can see this happening is through the different models of communication that have been developed. So remember that a model is a diagram or a demonstration of a theory. It's literally trying to draw out this abstract theory that you have. So definitions tell us how theorists are thinking about a concept, which is why definitions, theories, models change over time and often become more complex as we study more about a subject. So the end goal of talking about the communication models is that every person needs to be able to draw and label all parts of each of the three models that we'll talk about. You need to be able to explain the differences between the models. You need to explain how each model represents a different definition of communication, a different way of looking and understanding communication. And you need to be able to apply the models in order to break down and understand real-life situations that you've experienced. So, Wood asks us in one of her focus questions, how do different models represent the process of human communication? Models and theories are ways of understanding the world around us through labeling processes and their parts. So what we include or not demonstrates how we understand the process. So we'll be talking about three communication models: the linear model. From that was developed the interactive model. And then now we more often work with the most complex of these, which is the transactional model, which developed on top of the linear and interactive. So, because they built one out of the other, we'll start with linear, move through interactive, and go on to the transactional model. The linear model. Remember that linear means line, and that's most of what this model is going to look like. The models are drawn out in your textbook. I'll give you some other examples of ways to think about them, because as long as you have all the pieces and you understand how they work together, you don't need to draw the model identically every time. So really figure out how you best understand it, and that's the version to work with. So our goal within the linear model is how do we get a message from one place to another? And remember that I mentioned that telecommunications, or communications with an S, really has this focus of getting the message from one place to another. That's because initially the disciplines were together, and there was this focus on this linear model. How do we get a message across a battlefield to troops on the other side? How do we get a telegram across the Atlantic Ocean? And then as things developed, the human communication kind of branched off a bit. But electrical engineering and human communication studies both use a very basic version of the linear model. So, some key terms of the linear model. You have a sender, a receiver. There's a message, which has to be encoded and decoded. There's a channel or medium. And some of these are rich while others are lean. We have some different types of noise. I'll break those down in a moment for you. So if we come over here, giving you a slightly different model than shows up in the textbook. So I want you to take a look, and so we have an information source, and maybe this is just what's going on in your head. Then a transmitter, which is going to be, if we're talking about people, right? It's the person. Through a channel, are you phoning? Are you speaking? Are you using nonverbals? What are you doing to try and get your message across? There's a receiver who then has to decode the information, and the destination is their brain, right? So noise can happen in any of these steps. So even though we see noise here, noise can really happen in any of these. We'll talk about that more in just a sec. So I've given you another version, right, I like the versions that have people drawn out. They're far more interactive, a little bit of fun. So what we have here is the classic can, trying to get from one place to another, from your treehouse down, whatever it is. So you got this idea, and you need to be able to convey it. So you encode this idea into words, right, or into gestures, or into whatever, right? And so you put it into symbols of some kind, and we note here we start to see noises coming interfere, maybe. Then you try and transmit the message, and you sometimes have external noise that gets in the way. In some form, hopefully the message gets there, and it gets decoded by the other person. So now they're going to take those really arbitrary, ambiguous, and abstract symbols that you put your message into, and they're going to try to make sense of them. Which is why we have the game telephone, and you end with a very different answer than you often started with, right? Because this encoding and decoding often has some things that get in the way. So, sender, receiver, message. You encode a message, and then the receiver then decodes it. They send it through a channel, which we also call a medium. And a rich medium is like being face-to-face. You see gestures, you hear tone, there's so many different ways you're getting the information. A lean channel or medium is, for instance, a text message. You have just text, and if someone writes in TextSpeak, you've got a few letters and maybe some numbers mixed in, right? So we've done things like add emojis, use emoticons, put 4 different exclamation points, write things in caps, and we've done those things to try and convey the tones that are missing, right? How many times have you had a text conversation and completely misunderstood the other person? And the reason for that, it's such a lean medium. So be thinking about what are channels or mediums that are more rich, right? Skype is a newer one that we get to mimic face-to-face as much as we can. Where do phone calls fit on the list? Where do emails fit on the list, right? So this is a continuum from very rich to very lean. And as I mentioned, we have a lot of noise that can get in the way. So several different types here. Environmental noise is external noises. So these are things that come up that things like bulldozers outside, right? Construction coming up, the dog is barking, someone's talking on the phone while you're trying to hear something. So environmental noises are things from the environment that are literally getting in the way. Psychological noises are things like you're making your shopping list, you just broke up and you're heartbroken, you're planning on breaking up and trying to figure out how, you're thinking about the party on Friday, right? Things that get in the way of the thought process because you're already thinking about different things. Physiological means your body gets in the way. You're way too cold to concentrate, you're uncomfortable, you're sick, you're whatever. Right? So physiological is your body's getting in the way of you listening. And semantic noise is very specific to the words themselves, right? Either someone uses the wrong word or you just don't understand the word they're using. There's a lot of jargon going on, right? So 2 classic examples of this. I went to the physical therapist and I had to fill out a form that says, what are your pain levels? And it said, how much does your pain level vary? V-E-R-Y. And there were 5 or 6 questions on this form, and it finally got to the point I could not understand what they were asking. And so I had to go to the front desk and ask. And she was like, oh, how much does it change over time? How much does your pain level change over time? And I was like, oh. How much does it vary? V-A-R-Y. I was so caught up in the vary versus vary, and I know they sound about the same, that I lost the meaning of the entire sentence. This is a problem when you're so detail-oriented. So that's very much a semantic noise. Another example is a town in the South wanted to honor actor James Earl Jones. For those of you who are unaware, he was the voice of Darth Vader, but he's also a black man and an actor, and that's important to the story. So he gave some money to help the town, and they wanted to put up a thank you for him. And so they put it together, and it ended up thanking James Earl Ray. James Earl Ray was the man who assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. So, pretty important difference, but very much semantic noise that got in the way of the message that the town was trying to send. So, linear model. Take a look again at the key terms, at the sender, the receiver, message, channel, noise, and then the more detailed aspects of those, because we're just going to keep building on these concepts. So we're going to move on to the interactive model. Right. Before we do, some examples of the linear model are the telegraph, email, a phone call, right? So I have a picture of the telegraph for you. So for all of these models, try and come up with an example and make note of it to try and remember how these work and how they think about communication differently. All right, so the interactive model. We're going to keep everything from the linear model, and we're going to add two new concepts. One is the concept of feedback, and one is the concept of fields of experience. So, the linear model, we had a sender who sent a message to the receiver. Noise potentially got in the way, and they sent it through a channel. The interactive model said, okay, all of those things still happen, but what also happens is that when we send a message, the receiver sends a message back. And so a sender becomes a receiver, and a receiver becomes a sender. And it's this ping-ponging of messages back and forth. What also comes into play is what we call fields of experience. And fields of experience are, what does my world look like compared to your world? What do I know? What do I care about? What have I experienced? Where am I located? All of these things are going to affect how you understand a message. And they're going to affect how you encode a message. And so when people have very, very different fields of experience, chances of miscommunicating are much higher. So, for instance, a way that we try and account for this in lecture, right? I try and pick examples that students know about. I try and adjust what I'm covering and how I'm covering it based on the feedback that I get from students, right? So I see you yawning, says, okay, you probably know this information, right? I'm going to shorten it and go on and maybe spend more time in this place where more questions are coming up, right? That feedback that I'm getting is the yawning or the questions, and that's going to affect how I put together my message. I'm going to try and pick pop culture references, right, to give examples, things that students are familiar with, because I'm trying to overlap our fields of experience in order to try and minimize miscommunication. So you'll notice that the model here is different than the one in the book. I like the smiley faces, but I also like to just demonstrate that the models can be depicted in different ways, and I really, as I mentioned, encourage you to develop the model, draw the model in your notes in a way that helps you remember it. So, interactive model, we kept everything in the linear model, and we're going to add that idea of feedback, that ping-ponging back and forth, and then also this idea of fields of experience. So then we have the transactional model. And so linear was developed. Someone came along and said, okay, yeah, all these things are true, but not enough. So I'm going to develop the interactive model. And then someone came along and said, okay, interactive, pretty good. Linear, yeah, sure, still accounts for some things, but it's not getting at everything, right? So the transactional model says, you know, people don't really ping pong a message and then feedback and then a message and then feedback. Really what's happening is it's this constant simultaneous process. We're always already interacting and communicating. The transactional model also added to the interactive version that we have the relationship and content dimensions of the message. So remember, we talked about that with the definition of communication. So it's in the transactional model that we learned about, oh, okay, all of our messages, are happening back and forth constantly all at the same time, but also there are these different levels of meaning that are happening. We hear more in the transactional model that context matters. So you can see here that the model in the book started to take more account of context and also time, as well as these shared fields of experience, right? So not just what's your experience, who are you, what do you know in the world, but okay, we're going to interact differently if we're at work versus in class versus out with friends versus with my family, right? So the context we're in really matters. And the time through which we're interacting, right? How long have we known each other? How continuous is our communication, right? So the argument is that when you interact with someone, that interaction is affected by the interactions that have come before, or if there were none, that's still going to affect the current one you're having. And it's also affected by the interactions that are going to come later, right? So all of them are this dynamic chain. And the transactional model brings in this idea that communication is constitutive. Constitutive is a really crucial word to know, and it means creates, constitutes, constructs, and really the idea here is that through communication, through interaction, we create shared meanings. We come to understand the world, right? We understand social rules and expectations, relationships, our own secret codes of meanings for different things, right? So we create those shared meanings with other people. So we constitute meaning within our interactions, which is why effective communication is often very we-oriented as opposed to just I, because it's this shared process. So, an example for you. On that first date, getting to know one another, right? There's just so much involved here. You're trying to hear each other over the restaurant noise. You know, whatever location you've chosen for your date is going to say a lot, whether you knew each other before it or not. And, you know, that first date compared to dating someone, that same person several months later, you can have a very different interaction. Right? So the transactional model tries to take all of these pieces into account. So all of the three models still matter. Just because we got the interactive doesn't mean we ditched linear. When we got transactional, we didn't ditch interactive and linear. We use transactional to account for the more complex relationships and situations in our life, but interactive and linear still apply in situations. So I'd like you to take a moment and in your notes record some examples in addition to the ones that I've given you of the linear model, the interactive model, and the transactional model. Go ahead and pause the lecture while you do that, and I'll pick up again when you're done. So let's talk about communication in your life. As Wood points out throughout the chapter, communication is pervasive. It's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, all the time. And as I hope you've noticed, a primary goal of this class is to help you understand how we use communication through explaining the theories and the ideas behind these interactions that you have every day. The chapter spends some time discussing how competent communication does come into play in a variety of careers. I'll leave the book author to review that for you. But to close out this lecture, just want to very quickly review the benefits that come with being able to effectively communicate. So Wood asks us, what are the benefits of studying communication? And she tells us that effective communication skills help you listen carefully, build good climates, monitor your perceptions, build critical thinking skills, manage conflicts constructively, communicate support and empathy, monitor your communication across channels, improve verbal ability to express your own points of view, and to understand communication styles different from your own. All of these are important for almost every situation you find yourself in. So I want you to remember, as we close out, that this lecture does not replace reading the chapter or taking notes. It is a supplement to help clarify key concepts. You will be asked about concepts not necessarily covered in lecture that are covered in the chapter. I strongly recommend reading the extra materials available in the chapter, such as the FYI boxes and the extra examples that she includes. These provide real-life, up-to-date examples of these concepts in practice. So, moving forward, make sure you come into the lectures having taken notes. Hopefully these serve to supplement them. And we're going to move forward to Chapter 2 about the history of the discipline before we move on to some more information about how to achieve the benefits of effective communication. Thank you.